Charles Darwin's theory of evolution redefined the origins of a human being. Herbert Spencer, however, misinterpreted Darwinism to introduce social Darwinism. Written by Richard Dawkins, the selfish gene indicates that racial hatred derives from the desire to gain more resources. This documentary shows that there is no such thing as inferior races. Those who stood for the rights of ethnic minorities were the pioneers in history. What is Darwinism? Many people understand it as the story of a monkey becoming a human being. Well, it is partially true. In Darwin's book on the origin of species, Darwin argues that each species had not been independently created, but had descended, like varieties, from other species. It suggests that any living creature on Earth has its origin. Why, then, are some animals different from others? Darwin explains that they adapt according to the environment. Darwin became interested in biology because his father was a prominent doctor. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was also the author of Zoonomia, a book about common descent. Darwin himself was a challenger and decided to be a part of HMS Beagle's 5-year-long journey. The voyage of the Beagle portrays what Darwin was seeing throughout the journey in a detailed way, even talking about the size and shape of the rocks in America. Thanks to such careful observation, Darwin discovered that the shape of a bird's beak varied from island to island. He identified that each bird evolves in a way that maximizes survivability and chance of reproduction within their environments. Every species will perish if it does not adapt to their environment. On the Origin of Species calls this preservation of favorable variations and the rejection of injurious variations natural selection. Darwin's idea forever changed the world. When he published On the Origin of Species in 1859, European society was waiting for the Belle Epoque, an era with tremendous economic growth and technological development. Most Europeans were highly optimistic about the future. One of the byproducts of such a social atmosphere was imperialism. A number of European empires colonized the majority of the countries in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Although he was a philosopher, Herbert Spencer had always been deeply interested in biology. He was once the secretary of the Derby Philosophical Society, a science club founded by Erasmus Darwin. He believed that Charles Darwin's theory of evolution can explain everything that is happening in both the natural world as well as human society. Such a belief gave birth to The Principles of Biology, one of his famous books. In the book, Spencer argues the survival of the fittest must nearly always further the production of modifications which produce fitness. This suggests that, in the end, the entire world will progress thanks to the leadership of the fittest species. Who were the ablest species from his point of view during the 19th century? Social Statistics, another renowned book of Spencer, provides an answer to today's researchers. Spencer asserts in the Portuguese settlements on the African coast, the free Negroes are taunted by the slaves as having no white man to look after them, and see them righted when oppressed. It reflects his idea that, unlike the Europeans who always challenge, the Africans seek dependence. He also stresses that women defend that state of servitude in which they are held by men. His perception towards a woman must have been the same. Regardless of whether his claim was correct, the West fell in love with Herbert Spencer. Virtually every European and North American of the time believed in racism and white superiority. In 1907, Rudyard Kipling received the Nobel Prize in Literature. 8 years before the reception, Kipling wrote a famous poem, The White Man's Burden, that declares, "Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward." In spite of some opposition, the poem was widely read. Is it correct to understand Darwinism as the theory justifying colonialism? The Voyage of the Beagle includes Darwin's description that these Indians are considered civilized and were now enjoying the fruits of their labor, by being dressed in very gay, clean clothes, and by being very idle. He was also actively against slavery. Adrian Desmond and James Moore, the co-authors of one of Darwin's biographies, argue anti-racism shaped Darwinism. When he was still a teenager, Darwin spent about 2 years in Edinburgh. After checking his library cards record, Desmond and Moore concluded that young Darwin learned how the white people and the black people are in fact the same. After all, John Edmonstone, who taught Darwin taxidermy, was black himself. Herbert Spencer's Social Darwinism did not take these into account. Spencer had cherry-picked parts of Darwinism to support his claim. More than 100 years after the publication of On the Origin of Species, however, a new biological theory that may justify social Darwinism has hit the intellectual society of the world. The Selfish Gene, a legendary book written by Richard Dawkins in 1976, asserts that it is an individual gene biology needs to focus on. Every life strives to protect its gene. This is the reason numerous drone bees sacrifice their lives to protect the queen. Biologically, every human being is part of the same species regardless of his or her race. Therefore, according to Darwinism, every race must help each other to prosper. Dawkins, however, points out that members of the same species, being very similar to each other, being machines for preserving genes in the same kind of place, with the same kind of way of life, are particularly direct competitors for all the resources necessary for life. Imperialism, similarly, was about the European struggle for resources. The history of Europe is full of violent conflicts within a relatively small continent possessing limited natural resources. This was the reason that, in imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, Vladimir Lenin asserts that imperialism is the monopoly stage of capitalism, in which the division of all territories of the globe among the biggest capitalist powers has been completed. Hernan Cortés and his soldiers from Spain must have destroyed the Aztec Empire not just because they saw the indigenous population as worthless, but also because Spain had to gain the resources in South America to survive. Similarly, the Aztecs extensively practiced cannibalism not just because their religion told them to do so, but also because their diet did not include sufficient protein. Is there no way to overcome racism? Fortunately, for the past 100 years, the world has seen a significant decline in racial discrimination. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended racial segregation in America. Nowadays, about 90% of the American citizens accept interracial marriage. Most recently, Rishi Sunak, the son of Indian immigrants, has become the British Prime Minister and appointed 3 non-white ministers. Nevertheless, it is also true that ethnicity still matters in the 21st century. According to The Economist, on average, African Americans are living a shorter and a poorer life. Numerous incidents also indicate an ongoing hostility against ethnic minorities. Derek Chauvin's murder of George Floyd in 2020 showed how most African Americans are being misunderstood by white Americans even after the election of Barack Obama as the President of the United States. Racial discrimination receded because of economic growth. Once the white people realized there are now enough goods and services that can satisfy them, they started to care about other races. When the 2008 financial crisis hit the American economy, however, the white Americans restored their hatred against ethnic minorities. Most of all, while the unemployment rate for white Americans was 6.3%, 11.5% of African Americans lost their jobs in 2008. It was not just the loss of jobs that threatened the African American community. The Tea Party movement, an American political movement reflecting extreme conservatism, began in 2009. 52% of those who support the movement said the African American issues are receiving too much attention. These people are now backing up Donald Trump's bid for the 2024 presidential election. Racism has returned as one of the central political questions. Let us not be trapped into this nonsense again, but instead restore the decency of public discourse. Racism is nothing more than a self-defense strategy of the Europeans who followed the order of their genes. Numerous challenges are ahead of Homo sapiens. It will be impossible to solve such issues without effective cooperation among diverse races, countries, and genders. Those who are fighting for racial equality are the unsung pioneers in history.